There was a time when the sound of steam trains, metal tracks, and distant whistles connected small towns across America long before highways and airports changed the country forever. Railroad workers, travelers, and small station diners relied on simple homemade meals that could survive long journeys, cold mornings, and exhausting days beside the tracks. Some of those recipes became legendary. Others slowly disappeared along with the golden age of American railroads. Tonight, we're going back to the forgotten railroad recipes of old America. And few railroad meals became more dependable for workers and travelers than a hot bowl of railroad beef stew after a long day beside the tracks. Long before modern highways and refrigerated trucks transformed transportation across America, railroad workers relied on simple, heavy meals capable of keeping them warm and full through exhausting days beside the tracks. And few meals became more dependable than railroad beef stew. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, railroad expansion shaped enormous parts of American life. Small towns grew around stations. Workers spent long days laying track through mountains, forests, deserts, and freezing winter landscapes. And because many railroad crews worked far away from major towns for weeks at a time, meals needed to be practical, inexpensive, and capable of feeding large groups using simple ingredients cooked slowly over fire or inside small railway kitchens. That's where beef stew became essential. Large pots filled with beef, potatoes, onions, carrots, broth, and leftover vegetables simmered slowly for hours while workers repaired tracks, loaded cargo, and traveled enormous distances across the country. The stew itself was never fancy, but it was filling, hot, reliable. And after long freezing mornings beside steel tracks and steam engines, meals like this could feel almost impossible to replace. Inside railroad camps and small station kitchens, the smell became unforgettable. Beef simmering slowly beside black coffee, steam rising into cold evening air, while lantern light flickered inside wooden dining cars and temporary worker camps near the tracks. For many railroad workers, meals like this became deeply connected to routine life on the rails. Tin bowls beside campfires, heavy boots drying near small stoves after rainstorms, workers sitting silently together after long, dangerous shifts while distant train whistles echoed through dark countryside nights. And unlike modern fast meals built for convenience, railroad cooking focused entirely on endurance. The goal was simple: feed hungry workers with food capable of carrying them through another day. To recreate traditional railroad beef stew today, you would need beef chunks, potatoes, carrots, onions, celery, beef broth, flour, salt, black pepper. First, brown the beef slowly inside a large, heavy pot until deeply caramelized. Add onions and vegetables before pouring in broth and seasoning generously with salt and black pepper. Allow the stew to simmer slowly for several hours until the beef becomes tender and the broth thickens naturally. Some railroad cooks added leftover vegetables or beans, depending on what supplies remained available during long journeys. Serve hot beside bread, biscuits, or black coffee. Rich, warm, filling. a railroad classic once served across camps, dining cars, and station kitchens during the golden age of American railroads. And maybe meals like this still feel comforting because they remind people of a harder version of America, built by workers who spent their lives following steel tracks across enormous distances. But while stews kept railroad workers warm during long shifts beside the tracks, other meals became famous simply because they could be prepared quickly before sunrise inside crowded station kitchens and dining cars. Few meals became more connected to hard-working railroad mornings than biscuits and gravy. Long before fast food breakfast sandwiches and highway convenience stores covered America, railroad workers often started freezing mornings with heavy homemade meals capable of carrying them through exhausting physical labor beside the tracks. And few breakfasts accomplished that better than fresh biscuits covered in thick sausage gravy. The dish became especially popular throughout the American South and Midwest during the late 1800s and early 1900s, when flour, milk, sausage, and butter remained inexpensive enough for large railroad kitchens and worker camps feeding dozens of hungry men before sunrise. For railroad cooks, practicality mattered more than elegance. Breakfast needed to be hot, heavy, affordable, and fast enough to prepare before long shifts repairing tracks, loading freight, maintaining steam engines, and traveling enormous distances across rough American landscapes. Biscuits and gravy quickly became one of the perfect solutions. Fresh biscuits baked early in the morning beside cast-iron stoves, while sausage gravy simmered slowly nearby station kitchens and dining cars with the smell of pepper, butter, and hot coffee long before sunrise. And for many workers, the meal became deeply connected to the atmosphere of old railroad America itself. Lantern light reflecting against metal train cars, cold wind moving through small stations before dawn, workers gathering silently around wooden tables while steam locomotives hissed outside in the darkness, waiting for another long day to begin. Inside railroad dining cars, cooks prepared enormous batches capable of feeding travelers and workers quickly as trains crossed mountains, forests, and isolated towns across the country. And unlike modern breakfasts built for speed and convenience, meals like this focused entirely on endurance and comfort. The goal was simple: feed people enough food to survive physically demanding work from sunrise until evening. Even today, biscuits and gravy still feel deeply nostalgic for many Americans because the dish remains connected to old-fashioned working-class comfort food traditions that survived across generations. To recreate traditional railroad-style biscuits and gravy today, you would need flour, baking powder, butter, milk, sausage, black pepper, salt. First, prepare the biscuits by combining flour, baking powder, butter, and milk into a soft dough before baking until golden brown. For the gravy, cook sausage slowly inside a pan until browned. Stir flour directly into the sausage before gradually adding milk while mixing continuously until thick and creamy. Season heavily with black pepper. Split the biscuits open and pour the hot sausage gravy generously over the top before serving immediately. Some railroad cooks added extra pepper or bacon grease depending on regional traditions and available ingredients. Rich, heavy, comforting. A railroad breakfast classic, once served inside station kitchens, worker camps, and dining cars during the golden age of American railroads. And maybe meals like this still survive because they remind people of an older America, where mornings began long before sunrise beside coffee, steam engines, and the sound of distant train whistles echoing through the dark. But while railroad breakfasts focused on keeping workers full before long shifts, some meals became famous because they could feed entire camps using almost anything people still had left. Few railroad meals represented survival and improvisation more than Mulligan Stew. Unlike carefully planned recipes written inside cookbooks, Mulligan Stew was created almost entirely from necessity. The dish became especially common among railroad workers, traveling labor crews, mining camps, and temporary work sites during the late 1800s and early 1900s, when large groups of men often lived far from towns for weeks or even months at a time. And because supplies could become unpredictable during long railroad projects across isolated parts of America, cooks learned to create meals from whatever ingredients remained available at the end of the day. That's exactly how Mulligan Stew earned its reputation. The recipe changed constantly. One pot might include beef, potatoes, onions, carrots, beans, cabbage, or leftover vegetables from previous meals. Another version might contain almost entirely different ingredients depending on what workers could afford, trade, or salvage from supply wagons traveling between camps. The goal was never perfection. The goal was simple: make enough food to feed hungry workers after long, exhausting days beside the tracks. Inside railroad camps, enormous cast-iron pots simmered slowly over open fires, while workers returned covered in dirt, rain, coal dust, and exhaustion after laying steel tracks across mountains, forests, and empty countryside. The smell itself became deeply familiar. Smoke drifting through cold evening air, coffee boiling beside campfires, lanterns glowing softly against rows of temporary worker tents, while distant train whistles echoed through darkness far beyond the tracks. For many railroad workers, meals like this became part of survival itself. Workers often joked that nobody truly knew what ingredients belonged inside Mulligan Stew because every cook prepared it differently. And somehow, that became part of the recipe's identity. It represented adaptation, improvisation, the ability to create comfort even during difficult conditions with almost nothing available besides one large pot and a fire. Even today, Mulligan Stew still feels deeply connected to old working-class America because it reminds people of a harder era built around labor, travel, and communities surviving together through shared meals. To recreate a traditional version of Mulligan Stew today, you would need beef or sausage, potatoes, carrots, onions, cabbage, beans, broth, salt, black pepper. First, brown the meat slowly inside a large pot before adding onions and vegetables. Pour in broth and season generously before allowing everything to simmer slowly for several hours until the vegetables soften and the flavors combine fully. Some cooks added leftover ingredients from previous meals depending on availability. Serve hot beside bread, biscuits, or black coffee around the table or campfire. Simple, heavy, reliable. A railroad camp classic once cooked across temporary worker camps and rail lines during the expansion of old America. And maybe recipes like this still survive because they remind people of a time when survival often depended on sharing warmth, food, and whatever ingredients remained at the end of a long, difficult day. But while stews and camp meals kept railroad workers alive during long journeys across America, some recipes became famous simply because travelers looked forward to them every time the train finally stopped for the night. Few forgotten railroad recipes sound more mysterious than railroad pie. Unlike famous desserts with carefully documented origins, railroad pie became part of American food folklore almost quietly. Different towns, railroad diners, and station kitchens prepared different versions over the years, but the idea behind the recipe remained surprisingly simple. Create a filling dessert using inexpensive ingredients that could survive long journeys and feed travelers stopping briefly along the rails. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, railroad expansion transformed the way Americans traveled across the country. Long train rides often lasted days instead of hours. Passengers stopped inside small station diners and railway hotels, searching for warm meals, coffee, and desserts before continuing toward distant cities, mining towns, and unfamiliar landscapes far beyond home. And somewhere along those routes, railroad pie became part of the experience itself. The recipe usually combined pantry staples like raisins, apples, nuts, molasses, brown sugar, cinnamon, and flaky pie crust into rich, sweet pies that could be sliced easily and served quickly inside busy railroad restaurants and station kitchens. Because refrigeration remained limited for many smaller railway stops, desserts needed to survive long hours without spoiling, while still tasting comforting beside hot coffee late at night. Railroad pie fit perfectly into that world. Inside old station diners, pie displays became part of the atmosphere itself. Warm lights glowing against rainy train platforms, steam rising from coffee cups, travelers removing heavy coats after long rides through snow, rain, or empty countryside stretching endlessly beyond the tracks. And beside nearly every coffee machine, there were pies. Large homemade pies cooling beside windows while cooks prepared fresh batches for the next arriving train. For many travelers, meals and desserts like this became deeply connected with memories of old railroad America itself. The sound of train whistles echoing outside small stations, suitcases stacked beside wooden benches, conductors shouting final boarding calls while passengers hurried to finish coffee and dessert before climbing back aboard slowly moving trains, disappearing into the darkness. Even today, railroad pie still feels strangely nostalgic because it captures a version of American travel built around patience, warmth, and quiet moments between destinations. To recreate a traditional railroad pie today, you would need pie crust, raisins, chopped apples, brown sugar, molasses, cinnamon, butter, and chopped nuts. First, combine the fruit, sugar, molasses, cinnamon, and nuts inside a bowl until fully coated. Fill the pie crust carefully before adding small pieces of butter across the top. Bake slowly until the crust becomes golden brown and the filling thickens into a rich, sweet mixture. Some versions included vinegar or dried fruit depending on regional railroad traditions and available ingredients. Serve warm beside black coffee late in the evening. Sweet, warm, comforting. A railroad dessert once served inside station diners and railway restaurants during the golden age of American train travel. And maybe forgotten recipes like this still survive because they remind people of a slower America, where the journey itself mattered just as much as the destination waiting at the end of the tracks. But while desserts and station diners brought moments of comfort to travelers passing through old America, some railroad meals became unforgettable simply because they were cooked outdoors beside the tracks under open skies far away from home. Few meals became more connected to railroad camps and life beside the tracks than beans and cornbread. Long before highways, motels, and fast food restaurants changed American travel forever, railroad workers often spent weeks living inside temporary camps built near construction sites, mountain passes, forests, and isolated stretches of track far away from major towns. And during those long, exhausting projects, meals needed to be inexpensive, filling, and capable of feeding enormous groups of hungry workers using only simple ingredients cooked over open fires. Beans and cornbread quickly became one of the most dependable combinations imaginable. Dried beans lasted for long periods without spoiling. Cornmeal remained cheap and easy to transport across railroad supply routes, and together the two created a meal heavy enough to keep workers going through freezing mornings, rainstorms, and physically brutal labor beside steel tracks stretching endlessly across the country. Inside railroad camps, enormous pots of beans simmered slowly for hours over open flames, while cornbread baked nearby in cast-iron skillets, blackened by smoke and fire. The smell itself became deeply familiar to generations of workers. Smoke drifting through cold mountain air, coffee boiling beside lanterns after sunset. Workers sitting quietly around campfires after long shifts while steam locomotives hissed somewhere beyond the darkness. For many railroad workers, meals like this became part of survival itself. The food was simple, but after carrying railroad ties, swinging heavy hammers, and laying track from sunrise until evening, simplicity mattered far less than warmth and fullness. And unlike modern meals built for convenience and speed, railroad camp cooking focused entirely on endurance and practicality. Nothing was wasted. Everything needed to feed as many people as possible using ingredients capable of surviving long journeys across rough American landscapes. Even today, beans and cornbread still feel deeply connected to old working-class America because the meal represents a time when communities were built by people living far from comfort, relying on simple food shared around open fires beneath enormous skies. To recreate traditional campfire beans and cornbread today, you would need, for the beans, dried beans, onions, bacon or salt pork, brown sugar, salt, black pepper. For the cornbread, cornmeal, flour, butter, eggs, milk. First, soak the beans overnight before simmering them slowly with onions, bacon, and seasoning until soft and rich. Some railroad cooks added molasses or brown sugar depending on regional traditions and available supplies. For the cornbread, combine the dry ingredients before mixing with eggs, milk, and melted butter. Bake inside a cast-iron skillet until golden brown with crisp edges. Serve hot beside black coffee around the fire after sunset. Simple, warm, reliable. A railroad camp classic once shared across worker camps, temporary settlements, and isolated rail lines during the expansion of old America. And maybe forgotten meals like this still feel comforting because they remind people of a harder version of America built not by convenience, but by workers sharing warmth, food, and long, quiet nights beside the tracks. Many of these railroad recipes disappeared quietly over time. Some survived only inside fading cookbooks, old station diners, and the memories of families who still remember the sound of distant train whistles during quiet nights across small-town America. But together, these meals still tell the story of a country built by workers, travelers, steam engines, and communities connected by steel tracks stretching across enormous distances. And maybe forgotten railroad recipes still feel comforting today because they remind people of a slower America, where long journeys, hot coffee, homemade food, and quiet conversations mattered more than speed itself. Because behind every old railroad meal was the simple human need for warmth, rest, and a place to gather before the next train continued into the night.